Hello, everyone. My name is Saveen Reddy. I'm a group product manager in Azure Engineering. It is my pleasure today to talk to you about Azure Synapse Analytics. In this session, I'm going to cover updates and roadmap. We're going to talk about what has recently landed in the product that you can use today. Then we're going to talk about what's coming soon. And then finally, I will give you some insight into what's top of mind for the team and what you can expect in the long term. So let's start by just summarizing what is Azure Synapse Analytics and how did we decide to build this service. What we saw was that people were struggling to build analytics solutions because they couldn't bring two worlds together. And those two worlds were the worlds of data science and business analytics, the worlds of data lake and data warehouse. In other words, the worlds of Spark and SQL. Different teams, different technologies, different security models. Synapse tries to bring them together. So it's not an either or choice. You can use the technology you prefer, the technology that works best for what you're trying to do, and there are no limits between them, no borders, no barriers. A great example of this is understanding what someone would have to do to build what they call a modern data warehouse pattern. Now, traditionally, you'd put your data in a lake, you'd land it there from different sources. You'd use an orchestration system to move data. You would use Spark then to do machine learning, training models, or maybe just preparing the data, because the data may be JSON files or XML, text. You'd cook that into native SQL tables, which are served with Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And they're served into Power BI for visualization and reporting. Synapse tries to simplify all this. Instead of a separate orchestration and data movement engine, instead of having a separate layer to do data preparation and machine learning and AI, and instead of having a separate layer to do data warehousing and serving the data, the answer is one thing. And that's what we have, Azure Synapse Analytics. And we started from a product called Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and we evolved it by adding Spark, by adding data integration. And in the rest of this presentation, we're going to take a tour down through these different layers of unified experience, where you can see both the user experience in the form of Synapse Studio, the platform in terms of data integration, management, monitoring, security, and the two analytics runtimes, SQL and Spark. Let's begin with Synapse SQL. Now, we know everyone is excited about machine learning and AI, so let's start there. Not too long ago, we announced a preview of something called T-SQL Predict. And this was a way of using the native T-SQL language to score data. And so you can see a little sample code. Well, very soon, this is going GA, will be generally available. The next thing that's coming soon is the GA of column level security inside dedicated SQL pools. So let's recap this feature. It'll be so useful for you. Let's suppose you have a table. In this case, it's patient data. What you can do with column level security is very simple. As a policy manager, you can say that certain groups of people cannot see certain columns, of course. In this case, what's demonstrated is we're trying to enable only certain fields. For example, in this case, patient ID, first name, last name, phone, email, but not social security number. So the policy manager does a grant select on that table to a group of users. In this case, this would be the nurses. You can see the social security number is not in that list. On the other side, if you look on the left, you can see when a nurse tries to do a select star from membership, the query will actually fail because, of course, the star would try to include the social security number. So the query will only work if the nurse will get only the specific fields they are allowed to get. So now let's move over to serverless SQL pools. We'll begin with performance. Now, we're always working performance. Recently, we've made some updates on just making sure that there's less variation when you're running the same query over and over. Our focus is now going to shift to making that first run query when you start using serverless SQL pools for the first time in a session, making that first query run faster. That's always a challenging task because that first query is also responsible for collecting statistics that make the subsequent runs faster. So it's a challenge for us, but we're going to continue working on it. The next thing, which is really going to affect those of you who are using serverless SQL pools with files in data lake, is querying large numbers of files. What can happen in real world scenarios with using a data lake is that someone isn't working with 10, 100, or 1,000 files. Their numbers can go 10,000 plus. We have seen customers with hundreds of thousands of files, millions in some cases, because they're writing a lot of little files that come from various sensors and various devices. So it's not unlikely that someone might actually end up with many, many, many thousands of files. So we're working on making this much more performant. So you should see improvements starting at 10,000 files and beyond. Now, another topic I want to talk about with serverless SQL pools is Delta Lake. Not too long ago, we announced that you could do read scenarios with Delta Lake using serverless SQL pools. That is available right now in preview. That will be going GA not too long from now. The next thing is another way we're going to remove the friction between working with Spark and SQL is letting serverless SQL pools directly query Delta Lake tables that are created in Spark DBs. So very soon, when your Spark team creates a Delta Lake table in a Spark DB, it's automatically queryable by a serverless SQL pool. Now, again, our recent update for Delta Lake was all about read scenarios. And eventually, we will handle update scenarios for Delta Lake tables as well with serverless SQL pools. For now, for update scenarios, you'll continue to use Spark inside Synapse. Now let's wrap up this section on Synapse SQL with T-SQL streaming. Let's begin with just restating what we have available now. In GA, what we have is the ability to stream up to 200 megabytes per second into a dedicated SQL pool. And how this works is it has three components. It has an Event Hub, then it has an Azure Stream Analytics job, and then the data goes into a dedicated SQL pool table. So it's three pieces: Event Hub, ASA, then Synapse. What we announced earlier this year was native T-SQL streaming in Synapse. And to make that concrete, what that means is from Event Hub directly into a Synapse SQL pool without using an ASA job and using just normal T-SQL. So that's what we announced back in March, and it is in private preview. We don't have an update on the private preview on when it's going to become a public preview or go GA, but I do want to share what we're working on. So first is customers are using the private preview, and there are two primary pieces of feedback. Number one is they want much tighter, much better UX, user experience integration inside Synapse Studio. And overall, what that means is they want to make the end-to-end experience just flow much better and easier for them. And the second piece of feedback customers have in the private preview is, besides the user experience inside Studio, they want even deeper T-SQL language integration. So we're working on both those things. And then finally, the other thing we're working on with the private preview of T-SQL streaming in Synapse is just more security stuff. Customer managed keys, VNet support, et cetera. All the things you need so you can have an effective public preview. So of course, the roadmap is, and we don't have a date yet, is the public preview of T-SQL streaming. Hopefully you won't have to wait too much longer. But when we deliver this public preview, I think you are going to find we have actioned that feedback, and it's going to be a much more integrated experience, both in the user experience inside Synapse Studio, as well as how the T-SQL language constructs work. Now let's conclude this segment on Synapse SQL with a roadmap slide, and that can be summed up in one word: unification. Let's start by understanding what we have available now, which is two distinct worlds. We have the world of dedicated SQL pools and the world of serverless SQL pools. The dedicated SQL pools are focused on scenarios around data warehousing, and the serverless SQL pools are focused largely around scenarios around exploring and analyzing data in a data lake. Now, of course, they share many things. They share T-SQL language or subsets of it, and each has its advantages. The Serverless world, it has super fast scaling. And of course, it works great for a wide variety of formats that are stored in a data lake. The dedicated SQL pool world has its advantages. Optimized table structure, column store, great for performance, and an understood world of security. Our vision is simple: bring the best of both worlds together into one world. And so, what are the key elements of that vision? Eventually, we want to have one kind of SQL pool that takes the best of serverless SQL pools and the best of dedicated SQL pools. So it captures both super fast scaling and works well with data lake with those column stores and native tables and optimized table structures. And with a common security model and a common T-SQL surface area, right? We want to bring them all together, make it consistent. So one kind of SQL pool inside of Synapse. And the only question eventually we want people to make, decision we want them to make is, how are they going to pay for that pool? And so there are going to be two kinds of payment models. One is by, data warehousing units, DWUs, and the other is, pay by data process. And depending on what you're doing, depending on whether you're just doing a one-off kind of exploring data lake, or you're doing an analytic solution that has to have capacity always available to do something all the time, you'll pick the kind of way you pay for the SQL capacity, again, by DWUs or by data process. It's your choice. But there won't be any differences about scenario. You'll be able to do both, data warehousing and data lake exploration. You'll have a consistent T-SQL surface area. You'll have a consistent way of doing T-SQL security. That's the vision of bringing SQL together. Now, you're going to see this vision be delivered over time in stages. And when we have specific dates for it, we'll share that with you. But until then, I do want to make sure you understand where we're going as a product. Okay, so now we are done with Synapse SQL. Now let's move on to Apache Spark for Azure Synapse. First, we'll start by talking about some general updates for Spark. Now, earlier this year, we announced the public preview of Spark 3.0 inside Azure Synapse Analytics. And it's been met with great enthusiasm. We have a lot of customers trying it out. And it is in public preview, so you can go right now to your Synapse workspace, create a new Spark pool, and in the options, you can select the Spark 3.0 runtime. Please try it out. We'd love for you to try. We'd love for you to give feedback. Now, we don't have a general availability date yet. We are working on that, and hopefully you won't have to wait too much longer. Now, coming soon, we'll start with these two, machine learning. There are some libraries, Hummingbird, Enya, Predict. We're just continuing to work on enhancing those. And then Delta Lake. Now, Delta Lake we covered already with Synapse SQL, but of course we support it with Spark. In the Spark world, you should know that Hyperspace, which is one of our key elements of our performance story, already has support for Delta Lake. And what's coming soon is the preview of Delta Optimize. So again, don't have a date yet, but you should not be waiting too much longer. Okay, let's get now into another popular topic with Spark, which is performance. The first is GPU machine learning training. So this will be in preview very soon. The next is intelligent caching. As a Spark job runs on these nodes, you can use this feature called intelligent caching. And what that means is you can set the percentage of the node storage, the storage that's on each node, that's dedicated to the cache. And that will then just speed up, again, the Spark jobs. Now, this is coming, but do be aware, it is unique to Spark 3.0. And the next is dynamic allocation executors. Let's just summarize what we have today. Today we have a feature called auto scale for Spark pools. And what that means is for a Spark pool, you can go into Synapse Studio and you can specify the minimum and maximum for your Spark sessions. That'll control the number of nodes and executors that are used. So that's great. And that's for the entire pool, any job running in the pool. There's now going to be an even more fine-grained way of tuning your Spark jobs. And so what you'll be able to do with dynamic allocation of executors is within a single job, there's going to be some user experience to control how executors are allocated. So instead of picking the number of executors, you can just set it to automatic, and it will automatically allocate the number of executors you need based on your specific workload for that job. Now, do keep in mind, this is going to be still affected by the Spark pool and its minimum max for the overall, the sessions, the min max for the sessions. Okay, now let's talk about what's on the roadmap for Spark. The first is some improvements to library management. This will take two forms. The first is pip and conda magics to help you install libraries easily into your notebooks. And the second, for those of you who are working with authentication and using our token library, we're going to simplify some of the usage there, so you'll be writing less complex code, especially when you're using Nexus repos or Azure artifacts. Preview R in Synapse Notebooks. So R has been probably one of the most frequently requested things people wanted us to support. So we're going to announce that preview at some point soon. The next is Purview integration. So Synapse as an overall service is integrated with Purview, but we're going to add some specific integration components to the Spark world. So what that means is it's really centered around lineage. So for example, if you have a Spark table, using the Purview integration, you'd be able to identify that table was created, the data came from a notebook. And then, of course, that notebook was running from a certain pipeline. And then that pipeline that the notebook was in consumed data from an original table somewhere else. Right? So you'll be able to trace this all the way back, and answering the question, how did data land in this Spark table, all the way back to the original table. And again, all you'll need to do is just have your Synapse workspace and just link it to Purview, and then this just automatically happens for you. So then we have elastic storage. So Spark nodes, you can take advantage of some temporary storage on them. So this will, again, kind of just make it simpler for you to handle certain jobs that require a lot of temporary storage that's local to the node. Okay, Spark streaming. Now, this is going to be a different kind of Spark job, one that is long-running, fault-tolerant, so it'll retry and create as needed. Great for streaming scenarios. And then finally, Impulse for better error messages. So let's talk about the concept for Impulse. Now, eventually, we want to get to a Visual Studio type scenario where what you see is a list of errors and warnings, right? That's easy to understand, and that's the vision for Impulse. What Impulse is right now is we're going to just parse and draw out meaningful information for those error messages that you see in Spark. Because let's be honest, those error messages can be very complex, and you have to just really dive into it and scroll a long way to figure out what the problem is. So Impulse is using some heuristics and it's going to parse it all out and find the pieces that are relevant for you and bring those to the top. So that's a starting point from Impulse, and eventually we'll get to that Visual Studio style list of errors and warnings. Now, I've mentioned Impulse, and some of you are familiar with something called Project Zen, which is in the same space as Impulse, but this is a different project. Okay, now first of all, Project Zen is still not open source yet, and when it is open source, then we can consider getting it inside Synapse. Now, what's the difference between Impulse and Zen? So again, Impulse knows about Spark and will parse the error messages to draw out meaningful information for a Spark job. And Zen has a different approach. It's more about just generic enhancements for those Python errors. Okay, so they're not in competition. They will work well together to improve your experience understanding what went wrong with your Spark jobs. So we're working on Impulse, and again, when Zen becomes open source, then we can consider bringing it into Apache Spark for Synapse. Okay, now let's take a look at data integration inside Azure Synapse Analytics. Before I get to updates and roadmap, I wanted to cover some frequently asked questions. And the first one is, what are the differences between data integration features inside Azure Data Factory and Synapse? One of the most common questions we get. And I wanted to spend time in this session to make sure we're all landing on the same page. Synapse and Azure Data Factory, ADF, share the exact same code base to do pipelines and data flows. And you could think of that as we share the same engine, the exact same engine, and we just rebrand them as Synapse or ADF. So they're two separate services that use the same exact code. So are there any differences? And the answer is, of course, yes. There are just a few minor differences that exist between those two services and how they use that same engine. But we want to eliminate even those differences and those gaps between what Synapse supports and what ADF, those few gaps, will be addressed over the next 6 months to a year. There is a document we wrote on docs.microsoft.com which covers what those differences exactly are. And again, we're going to get rid of them. Second most popular question: should I use a Synapse workspace or should I use an ADF instance? A little more complicated. And it is an it depends kind of answer. So if you're starting new, that is, you haven't used ADF before, just start with Synapse, because you get essentially everything. And I talked in the previous FAQ that we're going to erase any differences. So you're going to get everything inside Synapse. Just start there, because you'll get the fully integrated experience in Studio and with SQL and Spark, and it all just works really well together. Now, for some of you though are working, you're not trying to build just a full analytic solution. You may already have ADF. You may already be using ETL, classic ETL tools. And in that case, if you're already using ADF and you're using these kind of classic tools, then you might find it easier just to begin with Azure Data Factory and stay there. But for the rest of you, unless there's a specific reason you need to be in Azure Data Factory, just go ahead and use Synapse by default. Now let's cover roadmap for data integration inside Synapse, because there's a separate session at this summit which talks in great details about all these data integration features as part of Azure Data Factory. And of course, as I mentioned, we share the same engine, so these same things will be available in Synapse. So I'm going to skip really talking about the details of these roadmap elements. However, I do want to talk about something that is very important for people using Synapse, especially that come from an ADF background. And that is in the middle of the slide. You can see there's an item called Migrating ADF Pipelines to Synapse. So because this is so important, we get so many questions, but I do want to spend just a moment talking about it. So previously what happened is, if you had ADF and you wanted to move to Synapse, it was rather difficult because you had to manually export your pipelines from your ADF instance, import them into Synapse, and that was, painful. Now, we're on a journey to make this easier, and the first part of our journey was recently announced, which was a PowerShell utility to migrate those pipelines from ADF to Synapse. So that's available on a GitHub repo. Now, that's not the end of the story. Our vision is that we can, have inside Synapse Studio a built-in experience to do this, this import, export, and do this migration from an existing ADF instance. So it is going to get simpler. It's going to take a while to get there, but that is the plan, because we know so many of you want to move over to the Synapse world. Synapse platform. There's a lot on this slide. I'm not going to cover everything, but I want to cover key topics that I think you need to know about. Now, a majority of what I have to talk about is security, so I'm going to begin there. Customers are always asking us for more fine-grained access control. We have a preview of that. That's going GA very soon. The second thing is Synapse, of course, works with Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. And Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 supports POSIX ACLs. And there is a lot of confusion on how to set it up, set the POSIX ACLs up so that it works with Azure Synapse Analytics. So we are writing a blog that should be available very soon that helps you understand how to set the right permissions on what folders, etc., so that it just works with Azure Synapse Analytics. This is more of an advanced guidance for those who really want to use POSIX ACLs on the file and folder level. If you're just using Azure RBAC to control access to your Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, then this is not for you. But for those customers who are really serious about super fine-grained file security, please read that blog. In the roadmap, I'll just cover a few pieces. First, managed storage. So that name, it may be a little mysterious, but let's just recap what the problem is. Today, when you create a Synapse workspace, you have to identify a Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. And you can't create the workspace without having an account. And of course, that account has got to be configured so it allows the workspace and the workspace users to use the account. There are benefits to having this approach where you identify which storage account you're going to use. But in practice, a lot of people who are just getting started struggle with this because it's another thing they have to configure before they get to their real work of analytics. We are working long term on removing the need removing the idea that you'll be forced to create or use or identify an Azure Data Lake Storage account just to create a workspace. And so the plan is we'll create our own storage, which is named managed storage, one we control for you. So you can just create a workspace. You don't have to specify a Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. You don't have to configure its POSIX or Azure RBAC or anything. It'll just work out of the box. So that's a thing that will really, really simplify people's lives, and it is on the roadmap, and we are working on it. The second thing is this thing called collections. Now, this has a very ambiguous, mysterious name, but here's the idea behind collections. That is not going to be its final name, but that's just what we call it. So today in a Synapse workspace, you add a bunch of data engineers to work on the workspace. These data engineers may belong to the same enterprise, but they may work on vastly different products. They want to keep their artifacts and things separate from each other, even to the extent, for example, that one team wants to have, their own Git repo for their code, and another team wants to have their own Git repo for their code. So there's this team separation people want within a workspace, and there's really no way to express that in a Synapse workspace today. So collections is what we call the solution to this problem. It is another way of taking teams and putting them in a workspace so each team will be able to use its own Git repo and have access to their own artifacts and secure those artifacts so that other teams cannot access them. And it's going to simplify people's lives because what happens here is now you can have multiple teams that easily work and share data, subject to security in the same workspace, instead of having to create multiple workspaces, one for each team, which is, kind of a headache to do. And then finally, the one I want to talk about is managed identity. System managed identities are things that created when you create like a Synapse workspace. There's a managed service identity, an MSI, that gets created. However, in practice, a lot of people, struggle using that system identified or system managed identity because, of course, since it's relative to the workspace, then if they want to add an Azure RBAC role, for that workspace, for example, to use Data Lake Storage Gen 2, then if you create a new workspace, you have to assign that role again to a new thing. So that gets complicated to manage. What they've always asked for is, hey, we want to use our own managed identity, so we're not having to deal with these system assigned ones that come in and out depending on which resources get created. So that's what this managed identity work will be about. You can use your own sets of identities instead of the system assigned ones. Will really allow people to be more flexible with security and simplify their management process. Okay, machine learning in Synapse, and let's recap what the vision is. And it's very simple. If you're doing machine learning or artificial intelligence, you should be able to do the entire end-to-end lifecycle in Synapse easily. And it doesn't matter whether you want to write code or not write code. It should be easy, integrated, and end-to-end. For those purposes, we have several things that are in preview, which are going GA very soon. I'll just list them off. Our cognitive services integration is the first one. The next thing is we have a library called Microsoft Machine Learning, MML Spark. That's going GA very soon. You may remember earlier this year we showed, and also in this presentation, we talked about T-SQL Predict using those Onyx models. Well, that is going GA very soon. So what's on the roadmap? Okay, we'll get back to Predict again. We talked about T-SQL Predict in SQL. Guess what? We're going to do a public preview of Predict in Spark. Same general concept will apply directly in Spark. Second thing, Azure Data Lake Storage, I mentioned earlier, It can be a challenge to secure things. Things may not work out of the box in some cases. Specifically with certain libraries, you have to do some extra work, let's say with pandas, to read and write data inside Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. And so there are two libraries, Pandas and Horavad. We're just going to make them just work with Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. You won't have to do any additional code. And then finally, some of you who want to work on retail AI, we're going to have a notebook, and it's going to be pre-built inside Synapse, and it'll just run it so you can do product recommendations. Now let's talk about Synapse Link. Our first stage with Synapse Link was introducing Synapse Link for Cosmos DB. Let's just recap how this works. So in Cosmos DB, there's a transactional store. What you do is you enable an analytical store, and then Synapse Link connects that to Azure Synapse Analytics. The benefits of Synapse Link here are pretty simple. First of all, you can do analytics on top of your data, and it doesn't impact the performance of your transactional store. The second thing that happens with this analytical store is it automatically handles updates that are coming from the transactional store. So you don't have to build another pipeline to deal with merging and updates. It's all done for you, and it all just works. Synapse Link for Cosmos DB was generally available back in March. We announced that at Ignite. And in the meantime, we've just been working on improving the performance. We're going to make improvements to how Synapse Link for Cosmos DB works with Cosmos DB containers. So today, the issue is that you can only enable it on new containers. So what about containers that have already, they're already existing? So we're going to make that possible. You don't have to create a new container. Existing Cosmos DB containers you can enable them for Synapse Link. The second thing is a performance topic. So remember, there's the transactional store, and then there's the analytical store. And the partitioning for the analytical store is determined by the partitioning from the transactional store. That may not be ideal for your query patterns. We will support repartitioning the analytical store in a way that's going to help your specific query patterns. Now let's cover some of the improvements that we're planning for Synapse Studio. Synapse Studio, again, is the one place we want you to do all your work for Synapse. It's built for data engineers, data scientists, and IT pros, all working together to build a complete analytics solution in one place. That is the vision for Synapse. And Studio tries to build that vision as user experience. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover, besides what's in the product, what's coming, and roadmap, is a frequently asked question. And this is applicable for people who use notebooks. This is the most common question about using Synapse Workspace and notebooks. It's a very simple question, which is, are Synapse notebooks the same as Jupyter notebooks? Answer is simple, they are not. But we should try to understand in what ways they are and are not. So first, they are extremely highly compatible with Jupyter notebooks. And you can see this because you can export a Synapse notebook or a Jupyter notebook and import it in the other system. So they share the same IPYNB format, for example. Now, where the differences are going to be around the libraries that are supported. Now, the first is, of course, a notebook can only run with the libraries that are available. And so you may, for example, use a different library. You can import ones into your Synapse notebooks, of course. But if you're using something that's proprietary to your source notebook, that may not be available in Synapse. So that's one area where you might see some discrepancies. But that's not due to the notebook, it's due to the libraries you're using. More fundamentally, the real difference is around extensibility, okay? And there are really two levels of extensibility that come into play here. And the first is pluggable kernels. That's a key difference here. So Synapse notebooks do not have pluggable kernels. They don't have that infrastructure. You can't add new kernels dynamically. There are only the kernels that the Synapse Analytics team builds that are available in Synapse notebooks. This is different from Jupyter notebooks, where there's a whole ecosystem of kernels you can install in your Jupyter notebook. So that's one key difference. The second key difference, again, around extensibility, is widgets. So if you are a Jupyter notebook user and you use IPY widgets, well, those don't automatically work in Synapse. Now, over time, we will consider perhaps looking at certain ones and seeing if we can get them to work in Synapse. But it'll be on a case-by-case basis. And in general, they don't automatically work. So those are the two differences. Again, pluggable kernels and widgets, IPY widgets specifically. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention inside Synapse Studio is something that has the official name for us of Workspace Database Connector for Data Flow. That's a lot of words, not a very comfortable name to say, but let me just show you what it is and you'll understand why it's going to be incredibly useful. So first is, of course, it's about data flows inside Synapse, okay? So in a data flow, you have sources and sinks, which are where you identify where the data is coming from or going to, okay? Now, before this feature, what had to happen in Synapse is you had to wire up several things. So of course you had to have, let's say in this case, a source, and then let's suppose you had a table inside, let's say a SQL database, and a serverless SQL database in Synapse. In order to connect that, you'd have to create an integration data set. Okay, so you have a SQL table, you have an integration data set, and then you have the source, which is in the data flow. So you have to wire up the source or the sink to the table with an integration data set. And that's fine. That's the way things have classically worked inside of Azure Data Factory and Synapse. However, in Synapse, it seems a bit burdensome to have to do that. Of course, because the table is inside Synapse. Synapse should know how to connect it automatically. You shouldn't need to use an integration data set. And that's what this Workspace Database Connector for Data Flow is trying to accomplish. You don't need an integration data set. You can just wire them together directly. And so if you look at what's on the screen, we're looking at a data flow and there's a source settings. Now, of course, this could be a sink as well. And under source type, you can see this option here, which is Workspace Database, right? So when you click that, it'll let you pick databases that are inside the workspace. So in this case, I have 3 serverless SQL databases, default, inventory, and sales. And so I can pick from them directly. And then once I pick, I can select the table and pick that table. So again, super simple. You don't have to create an integration data set for every little table you want to use in a data flow. This will dramatically simplify the lives of those engineers creating data flows inside Synapse. So now that I've shown you what the Workspace Database Connector for Data Flow does, I'm happy to announce it is in preview. You can go to Synapse Studio now and try it out. And of course, please send us your feedback. What's coming soon? We're going to do some quality of life improvements around the organization of things in the studio. So those are going to be focused on the homepage. You're going to see some updates. You're going to see some updates on how things are laid out there. As well as in the Data Hub, you have the Object Explorer. That is essentially the tree that shows you the Spark databases and the SQL databases, et cetera. We're going to just relay that out a bit, maybe change a few names there so it's a bit easier to understand what you're looking at, and it should simplify your lives. Now let's talk about community and education. First thing, we had a lot of feedback that people who are writing code, developers, were having trouble finding links to resources. They couldn't find the docs, they couldn't find the blog, they couldn't find where to ask technical questions, they couldn't find the repos. We have a solution. We have a page up called aka.ms Synapse for Developers, which just lists all the developer resources. It's just a list of links, lightweight. If you're looking for information on Synapse and you need to write code, you're not into marketing, this is the place to go to. Next, the Synapse blog. So this is, of course, we're blogging here all the time, and you can always get there by going to aka.ms/Synapse blog. So what do we have planned? We're going to be updating the look and feel, and most importantly, very soon we'll be doing a monthly blog post that will cover the entire set of everything that's going on in Synapse. It's going to tell you what the updates are, so that you know what things to try and you understand how we're innovating and adding to this product over time. So again, this will start this year, and it's going to be every month toward the beginning of the month, and it'll cover everything that has been launched in Synapse in the previous month. I think you'll really get a lot out of that blog, and I encourage you to read it every time it comes out. Okay, so besides the blog, Another thing we know people are really looking for is video content to help understand what's new and, of course, how to use specific features. So we have created very recently our own YouTube channel, and that you can get there by going to aka.ms/synapse YouTube. Now, we just began this site or this YouTube channel, so there's not a lot there, but we have 3 initial playlists, Essentials, How To, and News and Announcements. So Essentials is about really your organization and maybe people who are just starting in your organization and want to understand Synapse. So you go there, you'll watch 3 or 4 videos, and you'll understand the basics of Synapse. Then we have a playlist called How To. That's, of course, demoing how to do more specific tasks to accomplish maybe a scenario or get something done. And then, of course, a playlist for news and announcements. And eventually, I mentioned the monthly blog. We'll try to have a monthly video that summarizes what's in the blog for those of you who prefer to watch a video. It'll be like 10, 15-minute long video, not too long. So you can catch up on Synapse very quickly by watching that video. And we plan to launch that also sometime later this year or early next year. Now, I mentioned that aka.ms/synapse for developers, and it links to a repo, several repos, but one of them is called the Synapse Samples repo. And it's in the Azure Samples GitHub organization. And so this is a list of all the sample code we have. We have notebooks, we have PowerShell scripts, we have T-SQL scripts, we have ways of automating tasks through Azure CLI, et cetera, and even small data sets. So this is one of the places you'll be led to from that list of links. Please check it out and please, contribute if you're interested. And finally, another way, which is just something I think you might be interested in, is how this repo is used. So those of you who are familiar with the Synapse Studio Knowledge Center, the Knowledge Center has a bunch of samples, like notebooks, T-SQL scripts. They come from this repo. So a curated set of the samples here go into the Synapse Studio Knowledge Center. Okay, and then there's another resource we added, which is trying to tell a story of a journey or sending you on an educational journey. So this went live back in June of this year, and we call this the Synapse Data Engineer Journey page, of course. And again, if you're new to Synapse, your organization's new to Synapse, start here. You'll understand the path you need to take to learn Synapse. Now, another page we've launched very recently is the Cloud Scale Analytics page, right? And this also went live in June. Now, it's different from the previous page because the previous page is about like an educational journey. This is about use cases and architectures. So you can see a screenshot on the right. If you're interested, for example, in doing advanced analytics or enterprise data warehouse or real-time analytics, you can find links there and examples of what an architecture might look like to build those kinds of solutions. Well, that wraps it up for this session on Azure Synapse Analytics. I had a great time sharing what's coming in this product. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and I hope you have an appreciation for the expansive vision for analytics that we hope to provide with Synapse. As you can see, there's lots of incredible things in the pipeline. So 3 things I'm going to ask of you as you finish the summit. Number 1, please try the new things I mentioned. Explore what you can do inside of Azure Synapse. Number 2, get engaged in our community. We'd love for you to ask technical questions, share your solutions and samples, etc. You can find all the links at aka.ms/synapse for developers. And then finally, maybe most importantly, send us your feedback. We take it seriously, we listen to everything, and we take action on it. And as we send that monthly blog update about updates, I'll share with you how your feedback has directly impacted Synapse. Again, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. Enjoy the rest of the summit.